Hello, EGP learners, and welcome to this episode of the EGP Learning Podcast Digital Primary Care Update with myself, Dr. Andy and Gandhi, and we've also got Andy again here with us. How are we doing there, mate?
Hi, I'm good, thanks, Gandhi. How are you this morning?
Yeah, doing well. And as you can see, I've got finally got my studio thingy set up basically. It's been a project I've been working on for several months, I think, despite the way that it looks. But hopefully this looks a little bit nicer than the kind of standard white background that I normally have. So yeah.
I love it. You look a lot more comfortable. You're not kind of huddled in a corner somewhere. It looks like it's better for your ergonomics.
So I'm on a nice sofa. Hopefully I'm going to be able to keep my posture throughout this. I was hoping to go for the whole standing prospect, but just logistics wise, it was never going to work. But hey, hopefully this will look a lot more attractive to people.
So Gandhi, what's on the menu this morning?
So we've got some interesting stuff to talk about. Last week, there was a massive news story that came out. Well, we say massive. It was an interesting one. We're going to come to that. But it's about one involving a company called AT Medics. That's a partnership predominantly down south towards the London area, and another company called Operose Health that we're going to talk about as well. And basically the agreements that they've got between them, which kind of hit the national newspapers in some way, shape or form. Again, we're going to talk about that. And then in addition to that, obviously the big news story from today is the NHS pay rise that we're going to briefly discuss in terms of our opinions and what that means and what kind of the whole prospect of it is as well. Just before we get to that, though, we are going to remind people to have a check of our episode from last week, which was talking about the primary care IT budgets and how you'd spend that money if you had access to it. And it kind of a weird little game that we created, wasn't it, Andy? That I know.
Oh, that was so much fun. I really enjoyed it.
And the feedback from people on that has been quite interesting, actually. I've had loads of people contact me through Twitter and various other mediums talking about, all the different companies, asking for opinions, all that kind of stuff. And a lot of this has also been brought about by the fact that CCGs are looking at the products they're now going to be purchasing as IT is predominantly becoming more and more focused for general practice. But yeah, definitely check that out if you want to. And we'll put the links to that down below in the show notes so you guys can have a little look as well. And we're cracking on with all our other stuff that we got planned. So we've got a GP5T conference planned for the end of April. So if you are interested in that, definitely join below. And we'll put, again, the links for you to sign up to it. So we're going to be doing our training trainers to train trainees. Bit of a mouthful, hence why we call it GP5T. And lots of other things coming out, including something I'm going to announce at the end for many of you that you'll be able to sign up for as well. But shall we get cracking, Andy? How you been anyway?
Yeah, I've been okay, busy as ever. Always lots going on with the primary care network to keep me busy. But yeah, so yeah, shall we crack on with this big? We say big story. I think it feels like a big story for us. It feels like it's potentially controversial, and it gets to the heart of some of those questions and misunderstandings that people sometimes have around the general ownership of general practice. Anyway, so the story, and I think I've got the GP article queued up on my screen. So
there we go.
AT Medics have entered into a partnership with Operose Health, essentially. So I think in order to sort of piece this apart, I think we'll have a look at so why is this controversial? Who are the players at play here? Who are Operose Health? Who are AT Medics? And then we'll look at sort of does this matter? Should it matter? Should we be worried about it? What do we think about it? So just to introduce who the players are. So AT Medics are a large group of GP practices based in London. They cover 37 practice contracts over 49 sites, and they look after about 120,000 patients in London. And I believe that they were the largest group of GP practices in London. I think they've done some interesting things around sort of innovative software programs and things like that. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about that when we get into the meat of this topic. So they've entered into a partnership. So they've not been taken over. That's not the language that's been used. And we don't actually know the details of what has happened inside the deal that's been done. The language they're using, Operose using, is that this is a partnership. So who are Operose, who are working with them? So Operose are a large private healthcare company. They are owned by Centene, which is actually really quite an enormous American healthcare company. So Centene have a global revenue, according to Wikipedia, of about $111 billion. So if you just put that next to the NHS budget for this year, which is about £150 billion, actually the revenue of this private company is in a similar ballpark to the total budget for the NHS. So they are a really
10%, I'd say, of the NHS budget, roughly.
Yeah.
Conversion then, depending obviously of the pound to dollar ratio.
Yeah, so they're really huge company. So this deal, let's call it, this partnership, means that Operose Health will now operate 58 GP practices around the country. So there's about 6,000 to 7,000 GP practices in the country. So that means they'll operate just under about 1% of GP practices, and they'll be looking after about 500,000 patients. So that's probably maths, but it's probably about 1% of the population of England, or again, just under 1% of the population of England. So it makes them a really, really big player. And they certainly seem committed to a path of becoming an even bigger player than that as well. So this is what's happened. So Gandhi, why is this potentially controversial? What do you?
Well, I think it's been a large agreement, partnership, whichever term you want to take, in terms of practices and the patients that they cover. And I think the reason why this has become a big thing is because Centene and Operose effectively are an American company. We were going to basically discuss the whole way that general practice is kind of managed and owned. And I think a lot of lay people, patients, even, to be honest, politicians, and sometimes even those working in primary care, don't quite understand how the relationship between general practices and ownership of the care that happens. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. But effectively, it comes down to this root ownership that's the issue with this particular story. And whether that's been a positive or negative thing, well, to be honest, that's for you guys to decide. We're going to, present some information and let you come to that conclusion yourself. But I think it's an interesting area because it's something that's rarely discussed, and I think that has an impact, obviously, in terms of the narrative and things. So, I mean, go for it, Andy. Yeah.
What I was going to say was, obviously, we do lots of different roles, Gandhi, so we're quite aware of the importance to declare conflicts of interest and where you're involved with things. So it's probably important for me to say at this stage that, so I'm a primary care network clinical director, and there are 8 practices within my primary care network, and 2 of those practices are actually operated by Operose Health at the moment. They did operate one, and then they recently acquired the contract for another one in my area. So this is quite an interesting topic for me, actually, because I've had some direct dealings with Operose Health and the people that run them regionally and that run those practices. And actually my actual experience of dealing with them is that they're actually quite good members of the primary care network. They engage well with meetings, and they don't particularly operate in a way that appears self-interested. They appear on board with the greater good for working with the primary care network, and the primary care network working with the other players within Nottingham City in order to achieve good outcomes for patients. And they've been involved in some community projects and things off their own bat, as they say, or own back. So I've had some personal experience, which is just important to declare, and it's probably important that I'm clear about that's actually been fairly positive. Yeah. And I suppose, and just some other interesting things about Operose. So I've had, obviously, I speak to the people that work, with Operose, and they talk about their company that they work for, and that company's mission. And it's interesting to see how Operose see themselves and how they present themselves to the wider system. And they do talk about their operations in the US, where they look after about 25 million Americans. My understanding is that those tend to be Americans at the lower end of the income spectrum, and a lot of those are Americans on the sort of Medicaid government schemes. And so they talk about having experience working with underprivileged communities and helping them access healthcare. And they've also been involved in sort of population health products around the world. Like I believe they were involved with the Ribera Salud project in Spain, which people were talking about a lot when ICSs were being set up, and there was beginning to be a move towards population health provision in the UK. So they point to a lot of positive things, So I think it's important to be balanced when we're talking about these issues.
Yeah, and it's important to note that the Ribera Salud model is one of the ones that's been effectively pushed as the ICS type of model that's now going to be used across a variety aspects of, the country's healthcare elements. It's about that whole element of integrated care. And as you said, particularly across our local patch in Nottingham, it was a lot of work was done to mirror that kind of model, and even, I believe, use Centene, the kind of parent company, as an idea to get some information and looking at population healthcare and that kind of stuff across the area. So they have done some really interesting and innovative stuff. And I think, like I said, I think a lot of the controversy or the popularity or whatever you want to call it in terms of, this particular story has come because of simply the fact that this company is American based. And obviously many people feel that, the American healthcare is one end of the spectrum, and then you've got the UK healthcare, which is on the other end of the spectrum, and you've got various different types of different healthcare systems in between and on the side to some degree as well. But because they are so polar opposites in the way that they kind of look at healthcare, therefore the view that American companies coming in and taking over general practices therefore has to be a negative. I don't know if I quite, I don't really subscribe to that kind of theory personally. I think it always comes down to the ethos of the company itself, and just because they're from somewhere doesn't necessarily mean that
America doesn't always mean bad, does it?
Yeah.
The American healthcare system has a bit of a negative reputation in the UK, I guess, as being inefficient, expensive, and not serving underprivileged people as well as it perhaps could. That's the perception that a lot of people have of the American healthcare system. So I guess people will tar a lot of American healthcare companies with the same brush, but that might not be fair, I guess, is what we're saying. American healthcare doesn't automatically mean bad healthcare or bad company. So I suppose, Gandhi, let's just sort of walk me through the route of why this has caused a lot of controversy, a lot of emotion, particularly around people involved in London, but also in the wider area. Why might this be a bad thing?
Well, okay. So I think the reason why it became a big story, like I said, is a couple of ones. One, because of the root origin of Operose Healthcare in terms of being an American-based company. Two, the AT Medics is actually quite a large partnership. As you mentioned, they cover quite a large number of practices and a large population area. And as a result of that, it makes Operose one of the bigger players in the entire healthcare system in terms of offering patient care in the UK, as a result of it, in terms of the care that they can offer. And I think it's that controversy around it that people are talking about. Now, we don't know the particulars of the deal. We're not going to say by any means we're experts. I will point out we did ask if AT Medics wanted to come on and talk about it, and they were interested in the idea, but because they were busy delivering 60,000 vaccinations, they kind of said, sorry, we're really busy, which is completely reasonable, to be honest.
Fair enough.
And hopefully we can invite them to come on. I must admit we didn't approach Operose or Centene, so that's probably our bad by not contacting them to ask if they wanted to join us. But you know what? I think a lot of this is, like I said, has come down to because of that root origin of the companies. AT Medics, I think, have done some really interesting things. So I've had a contact with them in the past in terms of talking about some of their products. So they came up with a really interesting network-based dashboard. So this was about a year or so ago when we could go around to conferences and stuff. I met a couple of the directors at that time, and they had some really interesting tech out there. And I think that's meant that they've become quite an efficient practice in terms of the way that they run things and the way that they do things. I think they're one of the first kind of practices to invest heavily in something called a medical assistant type of role. And there's various different definitions of it, but basically someone to help the clinicians do a lot of the documentation and the admin side of things. So specifically focusing on those roles, I know that they were quite innovative in the way that they pushed into those roles really heavily. And that was well before things like, networks and that kind of stuff were fully up and running. So they'd invested a lot of time and, effort into developing that, which can actually, me and having someone else to help you do the admin can make your life a lot easier, mean that you can see more patients, hopefully more effectively in things. So, I think the root elements of the companies is there. The question is, how is this going to result in patient care? And I think that's the part we have to focus on from a perspective, how practices are owned. Is that as much of an issue as to how they're run? I don't think so. I think it always comes down to how they're run. and that's the part we should be focusing on.
Yeah, I'm gonna lay out the landscape here in terms of where I see the controversy has come from, really. And I think there are a few sort of key beliefs about how primary care could or should be delivered that this brings into sharp focus, and it brings a focus on how they're sort of can be at odds with each other. So you will have some people who'll say, actually, one of the strengths of the tradition of general practice in the UK is that what you have small and medium-sized enterprises that are led by GPs, not always GPs these days, sometimes managers, nurses, anyone could be a GP partner now, but they're led by people who work within those organizations and see patients in that community on a daily basis and work side by side with the rest of the workforce that deliver care to those patients. They're not in an office, in a headquarters somewhere else in the country or somewhere else in the world. They're in that community. That's where they work, and they might even live closely. And people say that actually that gives you a very responsive organization when it works well, and that's a strong strength. So a lot of people will come from that direction and say that's what we need to keep. There will be other people who'll say actually you have a lot of variation in the quality of those small and medium-sized companies, and a lot of variation in the quality of how they're led, and the quality of the leadership, and the quality of the care, and the quality of the outcomes that they get. We've got to be a little bit controversial to really get to the core of this, really. But and people will say, actually, that's a bad thing. Sometimes it works in an excellent way. Sometimes it's not so excellent. And that's an issue. On the other hand, there are people who might come with more of a business head-on in a way and say, actually, what you get from larger companies is you get access to more money, more investment. They can do things more efficiently. You can have really fantastic regional leaders and managers that do that high-level strategy, and you can concentrate the resources that pay for that in those really great regional figures, so that actually rather than each small practice having a fairly bog standard manager, you can have an organization with fantastic management team that can be a lot more efficient because it's larger. It can do all of its back office in one place. Actually you can get something that's actually more efficient and more effective, and it delivers better care overall. So people say actually big, maybe is better, I guess. And I think this debate almost puts those, and people have been talking about this for a long time, but it almost puts those two things at an extreme. So you've got a potentially enormous foreign concern with ultimate leadership elsewhere and shareholders elsewhere, versus the traditional locally led general practice model. So that's interesting. Yeah. Have you got any thoughts about that, Gandhi? I know this is controversial. I feel this is controversial for us.
And I think possibly the other part of it comes from the general perspective still being that, your GP, kind of the old Dr. Finlay kind of model of general practice is what most people still seem to feel like they want. They want that absolute personal relationship with, your doctor being able to control absolutely everything about your healthcare and being that point of contact and, that continuity all the way through cradle to grave, which actually we can achieve. But increasingly with the structure and the presence and the funding and all the other aspects of general practice that occurs, what we are having to see is that change in terms of, the organization, the way that practices have to run. And I guess one of the key things I've always felt, and I'm probably going to get flamed on social media for saying this now, is that, partnerships, which is how most practices run, like you said, those small to medium partnerships, or whether they're much larger and, corporate kind of partnerships and stuff. Just because you're a GP doesn't make you partnership material. It doesn't mean that you have a business head that you can actually run a practice. That used to be, I think, that the model that many people assigned themselves when they came into the profession, that I start off as a GP trainee, I become a salaried or locum doctor for a bit, and then I become a partner, and that was my career plan as such. And then I, become a partner, and that's where I am. I don't think that's the case. I think there are definitely some people where that works. But at the same time, just because you're a GP partner doesn't mean you're good for running business, and vice versa. So I think that's where some of this complexity comes through, both from a patient perspective, from a clinician perspective. And I think sometimes people need to think about, is that the best way to be running things? And actually, my experience is the best person to run a practice is somebody with a really smart business head on, but also twin that with somebody with a really good patient perspective. And when you've got those two things together, that's when you get really good effectiveness. And obviously, I'm just talking about minimal basis. That can also be much larger, smaller, etc. Did that make any sense? Because I kind of felt like I was waffling a bit there.
No, that made sense, Gandhi. And I think what you're illustrating is that this is happening within the context of, I think what you're describing is a dissatisfaction with the partnership model amongst GPs, people coming up through GP training and into salaried GP positions. And maybe dissatisfaction is the wrong word, but a sense that the GP partnership model is up for debate, whether that's the right model everywhere going forwards. I mean, I remember, I think it's Nigel Watson. I've met the guy. I'm just trying to remember his name. But he did a big review into the partnership model, didn't he? A few years ago, and he actually came to my practice and sat down. So I had some direct interaction with Nigel about this. And hello, if you're watching, Nigel. And he wrote a report which actually had some good recommendations about modifying who and how GP contracts can be held, and opening up the model to different. We could have a separate discussion and an episode about all of this, but actually opening it up to different ownership models that actually limited the business liability that falls upon partners, and actually would make it more attractive. But then I think we had Brexit, and then we had coronavirus, and none of these things appear to be being put into place. But there were some really good recommendations. But yeah, that's the background amidst which all of this happens, and I think that's why perhaps the GP community is perhaps more willing than it was in the past to hand over ownership of general practice to companies like Operose and other larger super practice type operators. Very interesting. I suppose so Gandhi, we are both sitting on the fence here, and what's interesting to me about this discussion is, I think if we were two GPs having this discussion 10 years ago, we would probably be saying much more negative things about private ownership of general practice. So in a way, how this discussion between the two of us is panning out is a little bit surprising for me. And I thought maybe you would be less balanced than you are. Maybe it's that we're both being careful about what we're saying. But yeah, I mean, what can I press you for a bit more controversy? Feel free to sidestep me, but do you think this is the right way to be going or not, Gandhi? A continuation of this trend of large companies increasing ownership of general practice?
So I'm not specifically sitting on the fence. I guess what I'm trying to say is that it comes down to the ethos of the companies themselves and how they approach things. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are definitely situations where I think bigger is not always best. And I'll happily give you an example of things like Capita running primary care services. That contract was viewed on a massive service outsourcing, the way that things work in general practice. And I have not been shy about being critical about the view that did not work effectively for primary care, for patients, for all elements of things. That was an element of giving work to a big company that just, in my view, has not worked. Many people have commented on that. And I think there may be examples where that's still the case. We have several large partnerships across the country. We even have what's called super partnerships across the country. And some of them I think work, some of them I feel could be improved, and that's down to the patient care that is delivered and the outputs. But the same can be said for the smaller practices and things, and small can be anywhere from a couple of thousand patient size to 10,000 to 20,000. What is your definition of size, really? And so I'm going to go back to the fact I think it's about the ethos of the people running the place and the outcomes that they deliver. What I'm trying to make very clear is where people are from shouldn't have a bearing on the type of care that they're able to deliver. And I don't think we can criticize their motives just because of where they're coming from. You need to look deeper into it. You need to look into their history. You need to look into what they've been doing and how that's going to look for patient care. And then you need to look at what that change means as well. So, I think a lot of people will possibly be looking at the change of, the partnership between AT Medics and Operose and what that means for patient care afterwards. Is that going to change significantly? Well, if it does, has that been better or worse? That's the key thing. And again, the best example I can give was the disruption that Babylon caused a couple of years ago when they invested into local practices and started to change general practice as a whole. They didn't do anything wrong by the rules. They just did something that was not made a lot of people unhappy, but it was within the rules. It was within the guidance set out by the government, and it led to mass digitization of the way that general practice works, which obviously got supercharged by COVID. So yeah, does that answer your question?
It does. And I actually like what I'm hearing in a way, or I think you're saying sensible things, which I was always expecting you to say that, but absolutely, yeah. Small organizations can run well or not, and the same is true of big organizations. So I think you're right to draw the spotlight towards actually, are these organizations delivering good care or not? And that's what should determine whether they're present or not in the healthcare system. I'm just recalling because this has happened before in our region, and I remember, and I won't say the name of the company, but there was another organization that was at one stage running a number of practices within Nottingham, practices that had struggled and then looked, with partners who were looking for an exit strategy due to retirement and other factors. And those were run by another company. And in the end, they weren't run by that company anymore because of various factors, but they stopped operating those contracts. And Operose are coming in and doing something similar now, and I think we need to see how they perform, and they have a good they talk about having a good background in terms of running services for deprived populations and population health, and I suppose we have to see whether they put their money where their mouth is, and and deliver that really in a way that the other company didn't. And it may be that they're a different company with a different ethos and they have a different outcome. I'm gonna say something which is potentially controversial, but then it's not, because I'm going to just sort of draw the responsibility back to the government in a way, really, because at the end of the day, the government are the people who, in this country, it's basically a single payer health service. So the government procure healthcare, be that at a national level, with devolved authority down, locally to our CCGs, who will do the commissioning of primary healthcare services. But they set the playing field entirely. They dictate how much they are paying for things and the expectation of what they get, and what the patients, who are the ultimate, consumers here, what they get for the money. So it really hinges on whether the government and the local people enacting the policy do a good job or not, and know what they're doing or not, and can get a good, good outcome for the patients or not. So that's where I think, this either, flies or doesn't, wins or loses, really. So I think in the end, it's all down to the government, I guess, in a way, whether they get a good deal for the taxpayer. And I guess time will tell. I mean, on the whole, I guess I'm quite a believer in the markets, I suppose, in many aspects of resolving things, that you give people choice and choices to choose between, and that on the whole variety and trying different ways of running things and seeing whether they work or not is a positive. So if I apply that philosophy here, then I guess I should say, well, we welcome competition, and if groups of GPs feel that they can also do a good job or a better job than bigger companies, then it's beholding on them to to do that job and, you know, outperform them. And if there is strength in the strong tradition of general practice being led by people who live within those communities, then, you know, GPs need to make that model work and competitive with other models, you know, and hopefully the government has the wherewithal to see what works best and to choose what works best. That's where I guess I would probably be.
Sounds a good place to be. But the interesting thing is, what do you think out there? All of our GP learners, you know, listening to this, you know, participating in things. I know Video's commented on the channel. She's made a comment about Dr. Gandhi, I'm a clinician keen on academics, etc., but my practice managed because it's the non-clinician with the business head that runs things, and that it seems to work well as a result of that. And that's absolutely true. You know, we have different identities within our practice of how we run, and you've got people that are more skilled in one particular area, and it's their value that brings the running of the partnership as a whole as a combined element because of that. So, you know, it's taking those skills and making them work as best as you can, and hoping you've got a good ethos, I guess is the best way I'd see it.
I am so interested to know what people out there think about this topic. And one thing that we haven't talked about is, so why was there no Pulse article on this? Or searching Google, we were unable to find a Pulse article on this quite big issue, but GP Online covered it quite extensively and quite well. So I just wondered about that. So if anyone wants to dig into the ownership model of Pulse and see if they have a vested interest one way or the other, I think that would be really, really interesting. Or if Pulse want to correct us and say, actually, yeah, we did have an article, then, you know, please go ahead and do that. Gandhi, there was another topic that came out. I can't remember whether it was yesterday or this morning. It feels like I've heard a lot about it already. The NHS 1% pay rise from the government. Yeah, how do you feel about this?
So I think there's very different views you can take from this, and again, I'm probably going to give a balanced answer rather than a specifically sided one. So obviously, the government announced that they're going to give the NHS as an organisation 1% pay rise for the staff and things, and definitely there is a large voice of people that are saying that this is just, you know, it's a smack in the face. You know, however you want to take it, you know, with everything the NHS has been through over the past year, the amount of additional effort many people have put in to try and safeguard the communities, the populations, patients, absolutely everything. You know, we've seen many clinicians, unfortunately, take the ultimate sacrifice, which is losing their lives. We've seen families, you know, had to bear the brunt of their loved ones working additional hours. I'm going to put my hand up for that one. You know, my family have seen how many extra hours I've had to put in to try and, you know, safeguard the practice, our patients, and various other parts with all my hats and things. And the government coming back with a 1% pay rise just seems like it's like, you know, it's like. So my view of the clap for carers is that I didn't feel it was anything that was actually helping to me personally, and this is my personal view, that this just makes it even more, well, worse than that in my perspective. However, and like I said, I see both sides of this. Just because the NHS was obviously doing so much extra work to try and safeguard our patients and our population through the whole COVID thing, I think it's also important to remember the NHS was not the only people doing that. You know, there's so many other people that were doing additional efforts, you know, from, you know, our public itself to, you know, policing staff to people working checkouts, you know, all the other kind of things that were just putting themselves at potential risk, you know, and I think it's important not to forget that. And there is this massive challenge that we've got coming up in the near future. The financial burden that COVID is going to have on the population and the economy itself is an absolute issue. And I completely understand that that's a problem. You know, at the end of the day, there's a finite amount of money in the pot, and how do you use that effectively and how do you use that sensibly? So yeah, I can see both sides. I guess I'm slightly removed from this in some way because I know personally I'm not going to see that 1% pay rise anyway. So we were talking about obviously the way that general practice is owned.
Shall we get the little violin out for GP partners? But
yeah, exactly. So for those that don't realise this, so GP partners aren't going to see this pay rise because we are not included in that. Which, you know, the people are going to say, well, fine, and people are going to say that's horrific. Again, it depends on where you sit on that. Obviously, I'm completely conflicted with that because I'm a GP partner, so I'm not going to see that. But we will be obviously giving that to our staff in terms of giving them the pay rises that they are due for the amount of work that they've had to do and things. And, you know, this is an NHS pay rise. So our staff, our employees of the practice, will be eligible for the pay rise, but the people that run the practice won't be, because we don't actually see an income rise as a result of this. So, yeah, and I know, I'm completely understand there's going to be people saying, well, here's my little violin, off you go, kind of thing. Fine. I'm going to stay out of that particular thing.
I mean, we are in the middle of a 5-year agreement around uplifts to the GP contract, which goes up by increments each year, that was set in 2019 as well. So there is some increase to practice income that was decided then, although it's modest, and I can't quite remember the figures now, but people are welcome to comment and correct us. Yeah, and I think, yeah, you're right, Gandhi. It's, you know, I think we've got to look at this with some balance. I suppose there are areas of government work where there are pay freezes, who have equally worked hard in some areas and maybe not so hard in other areas as a result of the coronavirus. And a lot of people in the private sector are really, really suffering, and, you know, have already lost their jobs, or they're going to lose their jobs in the future. And the government is borrowing more money than ever in order to help the country through the coronavirus, you know, pandemic, or the disaster really that it's been on a kind of personal, economic level. And we're going to be dealing with that for a long time going forwards. But I suppose on the other hand, the NHS has worked really, really hard, and the public has demonstrated that they are grateful. I guess what I'm going to say is, I think I'm not sure that pay increases and annual pay settlements should be about rewarding people or not for responding things. Personally, I don't think that's what annual pay settlements are about, because you and partly this is a result of being in a position of setting pay increases for staff, you know, within a practice, I guess. You know, that's what bonuses are for, in my mind. You know, because a bonus is a non-recurrent expense on the practice, the NHS, the government. You know, I think that's how you say thank you for exceptional circumstances. And actual pay increases should be much more to do with inflation, increases in cost of living, how much you need to compete on a wage terms to recruit the caliber of people that you need, you know, in those jobs as well. You know, that's a factor for an employer. And I think actually on those terms, a 1% pay rise probably still isn't enough. But probably I've heard people asking for 12% and things like that. And I think that's probably too much, in my opinion. So I think actually annual pay increases, it's about something different, and it's about the long term. And if actually we want to reward people in the NHS, we should be talking more about a one-off bonus, which no one is really talking about. But that's where I sit on it. And maybe that's controversial. Maybe it's not. But it's an interesting topic, and I think there'll be a lot of column inches and a lot of it's the sort of thing the media loves, because it allows them to pit professionals against the government, and you'll get a lot of, you know, it'll fill the airwaves for a few days. So it's a nice bit of controversy.
I will add my own personal perspective, though, that comes in, that every single time the politician pay rise seems to come up, it seems to be considerably larger than all the other ones they seem to approve. So it will be interesting to see how that manifests itself the next time that comes around, whether or not yet again the politicians feel that their pay rises should be considerable compared to the rest of the population. So yeah.
Gandhi, I'm gonna up your controversy here, and I'm gonna say I don't think politicians are paid enough. I'm gonna be really controversial here. I think actually I don't think MPs are paid enough. They do. There's only 600 or so of them. They do one of the most important jobs in the country in terms of making sure the country is well led. The country is not always well led, and I think it's because we don't have the right caliber of people in those jobs, and actually they don't get paid enough to attract people in. You know, we probably want people who are capable of running multinational companies or being very successful lawyers or doctors or dentists, and those people earn more than MPs do and earn more than ministers do in many ways. And I think we just end up with people who just aren't good enough in those jobs, and that actually we'd save more money for the country overall if we invested in better leadership. Go on my soapbox a little bit there. If anyone wants to come back and challenge me on that, that's absolutely fine. But yeah, just thought I'd one up your controversy there with that comment.
Oh, I'm going to take it one step further. If I could rewrite time and space, which, you know, sometimes I comment I can do, but let's be honest, in this particular situation, I can't. If I could, so a lot of the GP learners know I'm a bit of a geek, and I love various different types of books. And one of my favorite ones is a book called The Tamuli by a guy called David Eddings, who unfortunately has passed away, but an excellent writer by my mind. And in one of his books, the Tamuli, he talks about a society whereby, in order to work, the society works by politicians and the people that run the country, effectively working like a republic. Okay, so we're not talking about democracy and republicanism in this sense, but when you work for the government, the moment you are chosen to do that, your finances are frozen and put into the country's finances. And when you finish your term at 5 years, which cannot be repeated, so you can only do it for 5 years, that's when you get your money back based on the amount that was put in at the start. So your finances are determined on how effective the country does overall, but you can't raise taxes.
Okay, I'm trying to work all this out. Right, sounds like an interesting model. So you're an advocate for that model in the UK.
I think it would put an interesting thing, put prospects in, because then the whole the way it's meant to work in the story, and let's be honest, this is a story, okay? But the way it works is that in order for you to come out of becoming a politician in some way better, you have to make the country as a whole more prosperous, more better for the population, because that's twinned into it, you know, the approvals and that kind of stuff. So you have to have done a really good job. Otherwise, you come out of it at the end of it with nothing.
But so 5 years, not a long period of time though, Gandhi. Might you not get short-termism? You know, is it best for the country to plan in terms of 5-year cycles? Would 5 years growth be at the expense of policies that might deliver longer-term growth? Oh, there's all sorts of issues of policies. But in principle, I like the principle behind it though. And I'm sure there's some way that you can entangle people's finances with a longer term period of success or not for the country. But yeah, interesting. I feel we've digressed far from our remit, but it may be but they're all interesting discussions.
You think about the NHS pay rise, whether you think it's a good thing, whether you think it's a bad thing, you know, where your particular viewpoint on this, you know, area is. Love to hear that. And definitely let us know in the comments, because that's always, you know, the best place to contact us and stuff. We did want to finish off by letting you know about our episode in 2 weeks' time when we go live. So we're going to do something possibly even more controversial than what we just covered today. And we're going to be talking about whether or not you should be a member of the RCGP. So this is definitely focused around our GP colleagues, because you kind of have to be a GP to be a member of the RCGP. But it's something that we've seen come up a few times. So we're going to be talking about membership of the RCGP and whether you would want to be a member. What do you think, Andy?
I think it's going to be controversial. It always is. And I'd be really interested to get some audience comments both before and during that debate potentially, because I think that'll be really, really interesting.
So definitely join us in 2 weeks' time when we go live. Next week will be content as always. And additionally, one final thing that will happen just before then, if you are interested, I'm running a webinar on helping people start their own podcast, and this will be on the 17th of March. So if you are interested, feel free to come and join us, and you'll be able to do so by signing up through that link in terms of signing up to the free webinar and things, and learning how to start your own podcast for free, basically, because that's what people keep asking me. So I'm going to try and deliver that on the 17th of March and things. So as always, EGP learners, any comments or questions, let us know. More than happy to understand and hear them down below. And as always, EGP learning is here to help save you and your patient's time by taking hands to your primary care and learning. And we'll catch you in the next episode.